or show the teacher is how to use these response cards. Okay, we're going to move on to our next article, which is the Murphy et al. 2005. And they looked at derived manding in children with autism, synthesizing Skinner's verbal behavior with relational frame theory. So we already kind of talked about a little bit what Skinner's verbal behavior is. We have the verbal operants, the man, the tact, the interverbal, autoclitics. And then we talked a little bit about relational frame theory throughout the weeks, but basically it is a theory that proposes that a stimulus is rendered verbal if its controlling properties are to some degree based on the derived transfer of functions. So an example of such transfer occurs when a behavioral function directly trained for one member of an equivalence class emerges for the other members of that class without direct training. So we'll go into that a little more. It might be possible to establish a repertoire of multiple mans via derived transfer through equivalence relations, which would avoid having to train each man individually. So basically, you can teach just a few set of skills, or you can teach one or two mans, and then you test without any teaching or without any reinforcement to see if other mans begin to emerge. And the idea is that you can have all of these extra skills for free. So you teach 2 mans and then you get 5 for free if you teach them in a specific systematic manner. So in other words, after establishing a single man for a particular reinforcer, it may be possible to transfer that function to novel response forms via conditional discrimination training. So subsequently, a child may employ these novel forms as mans without a direct training history for doing so. So there was 3 experiments that they conducted in this study, and they did this with 3 children with autism, and they wanted to examine the derived transfer of man functions, a transitive conditioned establishing operation. So the CEO was arranged. And specifically, this operation involved the absence of tokens from a token board and a test that required children to mand for X1 and X2 tokens by presenting stimulus cards A1 and A2 respectively. Conditional discrimination training trials were conducted as follows. They had A1, B1, C1, A2, B2, C2. And then they had test trials that they conducted for the derived transfer of 2 distinct man response functions in accordance with the trained conditional discriminations. So that is, the tests were conducted to determine if the children would mand for the 2 X tokens using C1 instead of A1 and C2 instead of A2, in the absence of direct reinforcement for doing so. Next, conditional discrimination training incorporating the 2 reinforcer tokens was conducted as follows. They did X1, Y1, Z1, X2, Y2, Z2. Tests were then conducted for derived mans for the derived reinforcer tokens in accordance with the trained conditional discriminations. So would the child present the C1 stimulus card to obtain the Z1 token? So experiment 2 was similar to experiment 1, except that the sequence of the events was reversed. So training and testing for the transfer of reinforcer functions occurred prior to training and testing for the transfer of manned response functions. And then in experiment 3, it was also similar to experiment 1, but the instructions were reduced to a minimum to determine if the derived transfer effects obtained in the previous experiments depended in some way on the provision of detailed instructions. So throughout all 3 experiments, they collected IOA for 100, and they demonstrated 100% agreement. And they were able to demonstrate the successful generation of derived man responses and derived reinforcers indicates that attempting such a synthesis may be worthwhile both conceptually and experimentally. For the sake of time, we did briefly go over that article. There are a lot of very specific details in that article, and specifically with stimulus equivalents and derived relations, there's usually a lot more details associated with them. So make sure that when you're reading through it, that you read through it more thoroughly, as we just briefly touched upon it. So our last article for this week's lecture is the Sisson 1984. We're going to pull that one up. Okay, so this article looks at an alternating treatments comparison of oral and total communication training with minimally verbal children with intellectual disabilities. So they describe total communication training, and total communication training is when you teach somebody how to sign while also saying the word. So I'm going to teach you how to, this is drink, and I teach you drink, and I'm saying the word drink, or I don't have anything else here that I know the sign for, but basically if I'm teaching somebody how to sign for bathroom, this is bathroom, and I'm going to have them do the sign while simultaneously saying the same word out loud. So, oh, you need to go to the bathroom? Let's go to the bathroom. And I'm doing this while also saying it, and that's total communication training. And the idea or the expectation is that the client will either learn the sign or the vocal spelling of the word. I'm sorry, not vocal spelling, the vocal emergence of the word just by the repeated pairings of saying bathroom and signing for bathroom. Especially if you're doing manding programs with early learners, they might have some simple echoic behavior or minimal echoic behavior, but they pick up the signs really quickly. If you're always pairing the word with the sign, that echoic behavior might start to emerge a little more, and then eventually they're able to start saying the words on their own. I've seen this happen with quite a few children. So in this particular study, they compared the efficacy of a total communication approach with the more traditional oral method. And this has been done by several investigators, and there's been mixed results. So they wanted to see if they could examine it a little further. So the participants were 3 children with developmental disabilities. They all demonstrated impairments in language. And all sessions were conducted in a room at the Children's Psychiatric Treatment Program, and materials included 6 colored pictures on a poster board. So first they constructed sentence pairs, and so sentence pairs were basically just them creating a list of sentences that had 2 different, like an adjective and a noun. So it was the shirt is blue, the fish is long, the tree is green, the bug is small. So the noun being the shirt, the adjective being blue, noun being fish, adjective being long. So those were the sentence pairs that were constructed. It had two components within that sentence. And then they did collect IOA, and they demonstrated that they had 90% accuracy, 90% agreement during the sessions. So let's go ahead and take a look at the graphs. So you can see, we'll start with looking at Eli, and you can see that there's an alternating treatments design phase and then the total communication phase, and they alternated between the 2 treatments, the oral. And you can see here that the total communication was the most effective at increasing the MANs for the 2 types of MANs, the 2 groups of MANs basically. It was effective increasing them for total communication, and it was more effective than using the oral communication. So overall, the results of this study demonstrate that the total communication approach was more effective than strictly oral methods in facilitating sentence repetition with 3 individuals with developmental disabilities. So that concludes all of our lectures for week 6, and have a great week.